Hey friends, I was talking to someone recently who felt they were really hurt and harmed by someone close to them in their family. And I was asking them what they thought about forgiveness. And they wanted to forgive, but they really didn't know how. And they didn't really sometimes feel like they wanted to, which is definitely understandable. And I was thinking, what really predicts whether somebody's going to be more likely to forgive versus not? Are there some cultural things, or maybe there's some sex differences, or what is going on there? And so I want to present to you some of that data here. And I think it might be surprising to you. First of all, I want you to know that by the end of this video, you're going to see which countries are the most and the least forgiving, which is interesting and surprising because of the national and cultural differences, but also what factors make people more likely to forgive. Like I mentioned, age, is it religion, is it culture? And also, this is important because you can predict something about a person when you meet them. Are they going to be a forgiving person? Are they going to be revengeful, spiteful, grudging all the time? And this is so important too because it shapes public health, not only interpersonal relationships, but also policy, because your relationships and also your national culture is going to change. So the reason this is a superpower and why forgiveness is so important is because although everyone's been hurt, we know that forgiveness is itself a virtue across different religions, including Christianity and others. But there's also practical consequences. People who forgive are more likely to be less stressed, less depressed. They're going to have better cardiovascular function. So there's really practical reasons too to care about forgiveness. I'm Omar Haque. I'm a philosopher and social scientist. Welcome to my channel. I'm going to cover some of the coolest questions with you on this channel. So here we go. This was one of the biggest studies on forgiveness ever. It was across 22 countries, and it was including 200,000 people. It was led by these amazing researchers from Harvard and Baylor University. And what did they find? Surprisingly, the average rate of forgiveness across 22 countries was 75%. You might think that's really high, or you might think that's actually really low. So if you're a really forgiving person, that might actually feel like a pretty low number. You might say, wow, only 1 in 4 people around the world struggle to consistently forgive. Wow. But if you're maybe someone who's not so into forgiveness, you might say that's actually really high. But that's the number, 75%. And if you look at particular countries, one of the highest forgiving countries was Nigeria. And they said they often or always forgive 92% of the time. Whereas in Turkey or Japan, it was much lower. So if you travel to Turkey or Japan, you might notice this in the way people treat you. But 57% of Japanese and 41% of people in Turkey said they always or often forgive people. So that's really interesting. Now, here's a list of a bunch of the countries that they studied and how forgiving they are. It's an interesting graph here. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger for you. But what you can see here is that Nigeria and Egypt are the top two. But underneath there, you have Indonesia, Kenya. These are not particularly rich countries. These are countries that are struggling in many other ways. South Africa, Tanzania, and at the bottom of the forgiveness list, you have countries like Japan, as I mentioned, Turkey, and Hong Kong, which is a fairly rich country, Hong Kong is. And you might be wondering, how is that possible? Look at the United States there. They're in the middle with England lower down as well. But this is the ranking that we have. And I think we'll get into this a little bit more here. But if you first look at how they tried to analyze some of these countries, this list here shows you that they're looking at poverty. So they analyze how much poverty is in these countries, how much conflict, the number of protests, how collectivist the country is, meaning like how much the country is oriented towards interpersonal relations as opposed to individualism. So an individualistic country is going to rank really low on the collectivism index. And here there's also, they ask them how much of the time did you not have money for food in the last 12 months? Were you assaulted? Do you feel angry? Are you oriented towards yourself? So interesting questions. We'll dive into this in a second, but let's look at the two least forgiving countries, which is Japan and Turkey. So what you notice here is, let's check out Japan here. You can see that for Japan, you have 0.7% of people were in extreme poverty. That's pretty low. And same thing with Turkey. They're pretty financially stable countries, and they're not really places where we can say, due to poverty, this country must not be very forgiving. In the same way, they're not particularly violent places either, if you look at the ranking compared to other countries. And they're fairly peaceful too. If you look at, for example, Japan here, it's like number 2 most peaceful in terms of being assaulted. And so we can't really say poverty and violence are really causing these things. So that's interesting. What else is interesting is if you look at the most forgiving countries, like I mentioned, Egypt and Nigeria, see, Egypt is not particularly rich, and definitely Nigeria is not doing so well. 30% of the population is in extreme poverty. In Egypt too, it's not like Germany, which is 0% here. And they're fairly higher on the violent side of things, so more unstable socially, and yet they're very forgiving. So that's a paradox. If you think that wealth and peace are what result in social norms relating to forgiveness. So I think what is interesting is that I think culture matters in determining forgiveness more than some of these other variables, and specifically collectivism. So what you'll notice is that Egypt is fairly high in collectivism, as is Nigeria. But if you look at, for example, Japan, it's not particularly high. So that's one of the variables, I think, collectivism that predicts forgiveness. Also, let's look at age. Are younger people more forgiving than older people? It's older people who are more forgiving. You can see almost 90% of people 80 and older are forgiving. And you might say they're cramming for the final exam, so they're getting more relaxed about stuff. But it might be something else too. It might be that there's wisdom with age and there's more of a larger perspective and there's more of an openness for the virtue of forgiveness. But definitely, if you meet a younger person, they're less likely to be forgiving than an older person. That's interesting. And that's true across all these countries. In addition, are religious people more forgiving? Yes, they actually are. So people who go to religious service more than once a week have 87% are pretty much always forgiving. And then once a week is only 82%. And then people who say never, it's quite a lot lower. It's 69%. So you can predict somebody's forgiveness based on how religious they are and how much they attend services. In addition, I think surprising findings, you might think that sex differences matter here, or being married or not married matters, or being an immigrant or being a native member of the population matters, but it didn't really show consistent effects globally. So gender, marital status, employment status, whether you're employed or not, years of education, these are things that in other studies have shown some correlations with forgiveness, but here there really wasn't a consistent effect globally. So not one of the biggest variables, like unlike religion or age. In some countries, widows were the most forgiving, and others, single people were. Different effects, probably mediated by culture. So some of the lessons I would take from this is that we really do see variability across the globe. Nations are not the same in their cultures, which is obvious, but when you think about it, it really matters. All cultures are not the same, and older people and religious attendees are the most forgiving. Culture and conflict history may shape this, I think, because national forgiveness levels, meaning like the culture that the forgiveness happens in, could be based on a history of conflict or the way people think about collectivism versus individualism. And also, forgiveness matters because it really is relevant to public health, individual health, and community health. So I hope you found this interesting. I certainly did, and I hope you'll pass it along if you do think of someone who may be interested. Feel free to join my free newsletter anytime. Thanks so much. Take care.